right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here tonight at the world-famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. We're here tonight with Lisa Niver, who's an award-winning travel expert and author of Braveish, this book that we have here with us today. So, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Phoebe. I'm honored to be here.
Absolutely. So you actually have a connection with the Adventurers Club before you came here to join us a few months ago. You know one of our members who many people here might know, who's since passed away. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
About Roy Rausch?
About Roy Rausch, exactly. Sorry, I kind of sprung that on you.
Yes, so it's actually a really incredible story. I was invited to the Solomon Islands, and it was the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Guadalcanal. And I was invited to do a story for Smithsonian Magazine, and I traveled to the Solomon Islands, and I learned to make shell money, and I went to see Skull Island, and I went to all of these World War II memorials. And I had an incredible trip, and I learned so much about the history and the battle and everything that happened in the war. And I came home, and my dad, who's a dentist in Encino, my dad said, well, do you think it would help you if you could talk to a soldier from the battle? And I said, yeah, Dad, that would really help my story for Smithsonian Magazine, but you know, it's the 75th anniversary of the war. He's really good at math, so I was like, Dad, I don't really think that you're gonna find me a soldier. And he said, oh, my patient, Roy Rausch, would love to speak with you. So he was 17, turning 18 the summer of the battle, and he enlisted, his birthday was July 4th. Mm-hmm. It was an incredible story, so I got to interview him. The story's in the Saturday Evening Post, and he was incredible to meet. Yeah, I know he's loved being part of this club.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought that was a fun little way to start, because it's so fun that you have this connection to this place. But so we're here to talk about your book, Braveish, and I do want to get into that, but first I want to talk about your history, because you got the travel bug early, right?
I did. So my whole family is actually travelers. My dad was my parents met in New Jersey, and then my dad was in dental school in Boston. I was born in Boston, and then during the war, during the Vietnam War, my dad was a colonel, a dentist in the Army, and my sister was born on the base, Fort Benning base in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And then my parents were, there's no snow in the winter. And they thought that was amazing, and my uncle lived here in California, so we moved. So we've always been traveling, and when I was a teenager, I went on my very first cruise with my family. My dad actually was studying on the cruise. They were talking about P&L statements and helping dentists become better businessmen. Mm-hmm. And I really think that cruise, when I was a teenager, changed my whole life, because I actually worked on board ships for 7 years. And in fact, some of my cruise ship friends came here tonight to be with me. They flew across the country and the world to be here. And thank you, friends. Because the people you travel with become your family.
Absolutely.
And so when I was on that first cruise, I had never thought that history was very interesting, social studies class. And then when I walked through the Parthenon, I was like, how can anyone make this boring in school? It was like my history book came to life. Saw the Western Wall, I saw the Parthenon, I saw the pyramids, I rode on a camel, which honestly was not my favorite thing. But it was kind of scary when it, leans down.
Why was riding on a camel not your favorite thing? What was it about that experience?
Well, because when the camel stops and it bent its legs, my mom and I almost fell off the front of the camel. So I wasn't too enamored of the falling off the camel part. And honestly, I didn't think it smelled that good. But it's the truth. And so, but I loved the pyramids, and I loved learning about, how did they build it, and how did you make the design? And I think part of that, it definitely inspired me to work on the cruise ships, but it also inspired me to be a teacher.
Sure. And that's what you did before you worked on the cruise ships, right?
I've been a teacher before, after, during. Sure. I worked on the ships with the children, and I loved that, and I taught science. In California, I taught in San Francisco and Los Angeles. I've taught in public school. I've taught in private school. I also I worked for Nickelodeon. I teach kids on set. So any kind of teaching.
Absolutely. Fantastic. So you went from teaching to working on cruise ships. How did you make that transition?
What really happened was I went to college in Philadelphia. I went to Penn. And after Penn, I went to medical school. I moved to San Francisco. I was going to medical school. And for a variety of reasons, it was not the right place for me. And when I left school and I went on sabbatical, I took a year to decide what was I going to do next. Maybe I was going to go back. I learned to scuba dive, and I learned to do ceramics. And being underwater, although I know there's a lot of scuba divers here, being underwater, teaching me to scuba dive was so challenging. I was a challenging student. I didn't exactly get all the directions. Do you scuba dive?
I don't,
Okay,
actually.
so when you're learning to scuba dive, you have to practice things. And they don't do everything the same as when I learned, because it was a long time ago, 1990, and you had to share your regulator. But there was an instruction. Before you give your regulator to the other person, you're supposed to take a breath. But I did not get that instruction. And so every time I gave my regulator away, I bolted to the surface. And my instructor was like, Lisa, this is not going well. And I'm like, I know. So it took some time to figure that out. And then there was another instruction before when you picked up your tank to go scuba diving in Monterey Bay, you were supposed to check it. So I checked it. We get on the beach, and there's an extra instructor, which I didn't know at the time was special for me, because I needed my own. And the instructor looks at my tank and my gauges, and she's like, Lisa, this tank has, I forget what it had, like 2,200, it was supposed to have 3,000 or whatever it was, whatever size tank I had. He's like, it only has this much. I said, yes, it does. He said, you were supposed to check it. I said, I did check it. He said, if it doesn't have enough air, you're supposed to give it back and get a full one. I was like, oh, I didn't understand that part. I'm sorry. I don't understand all the instructions all the time. And so I had to use my instructor's gear. He traded with me. Because we were shore diving and we'd walked across all this sand and we were far from the parking lot. Anyway, there's been a lot of situations like that in my life where I don't understand all the instructions. But I left medical school, I learned to scuba dive, I started teaching, and the problem I had was I wanted to go on all the exotic vacations that everyone was talking about, but preschool teachers cannot afford this.
Sure.
So I left my job and I went to work for Club Med, except they offered me a job in Colorado in the mountains.
Which
There's
is not
no
a
scuba
great
diving there.
Yeah.
So I worked in Colorado, and then they sent me to the Bahamas. And then at Club Med, if you work 2 contracts, it's so rare that people finish 2 contracts at the time that you could go anywhere in the world for 2 weeks for free. And so I went scuba diving finally. And there, magically, I met all these people that worked on cruise ships, and they made twice as much money as me. And I know, $900 a month. And I was like, that's 100% raise. And so, and every night your house moves. You get to travel, scuba dive, they pay you. I was like, sign me up.
Sure. I'm sure most places that cruises go are probably better for scuba diving than Colorado, at least.
Phoebe, you follow along. Yep. Most places are better for scuba diving. I mean, I did ski every day.
Sure.
It wasn't a hardship, but it was not scuba diving.
Sure.
And so, a lot of things that have happened in my life, it's like, I think I'm on this direction, and then I'm not. Someone recently asked me in an interview to describe my career, and I said, well, do you remember the game Chutes and Ladders? Because that's what it's been like. It's like, oh, things are so not so great anymore. But in the end, I've really had a lot of great adventures. But
Sure.
Yes, it's been but scuba diving changed my life. When I finally learned to follow all those instructions, you should take a breath before you share air, you should check the tank, give it back.
What was it that made you want to keep going, even though you were struggling, with going up to the surface and not quite
mean,
following
why did
the
I not give
instructions?
up?
Why did you not give up? Exactly. I was trying to think
Why
of
did I
a
not
way to
give
say
up
that.
scuba diving? It was so hard.
Did you just love it from the beginning?
No, I did not love it at all. What happened was, So growing up, I had a lot of accidents. A lot of accidents. Everyone said I was very clumsy. I had a near drowning. I landed on my head from a bike accident. Of course, it was the 70s, so no one had a helmet. And then I was in a kids group. We were like family summer camp, and I fell on my head. I blacked out. When I came to, everybody was around me. I opened my eyes, and the counselor said, "Get back on your bike. We have to ride back." I'm like, we would never do that now. But, that's what we did then. Anyway, so I'd had all these accidents, and I don't know. So when I was in college, my best friend was an NCAA synchronized swimmer. And every night she was at the gym being a lifeguard or swimming or practicing, and I was at the library, and I would pick her up. And one day I was like, I come to the gym every single day, but I never go inside. And she said, "Would you like to swim?" And I was like, "That's a terrible idea." And so she and my other roommate were both lifeguards, and like, "You just try to drown with both of us watching." I was like, this is not inspiring. But they managed to teach me to swim. And then when I was in med school and living in San Francisco, everyone was super active. They were playing Frisbee and Ultimate Frisbee, and they made up all these other games. And I couldn't play any. I feel like I couldn't play any of the reindeer games. But I couldn't do it. We didn't know why at the time, but we knew I couldn't. But I could swim. So I was determined to do something, and I think I just refused to give up on scuba diving because swimming was so hard. But once I finally relearned to swim as an adult, I was pretty decent, and I was like, what do swimmers do? They go scuba diving. So I think I just wanted to have that success. I felt a little jealous that all these other people could do all these fun things, and I was like, I'm going to keep trying.
Sure. And now you're an incredibly accomplished scuba diver. So
I have
it really
done
worked
some
out.
crazy dives.
Absolutely. So let's get back to talking about working on cruise ships, because you said you did that for 7 years, right? Where in the world did you go when you were working on cruise ships?
I literally sailed the 7 seas, except for Antarctica. That was my recent journey. At the time that I worked on cruise ships many years ago, really none of the major cruise lines, the mainstream cruise lines went, really only expeditions. So I sailed 3 summers in Alaska, which I loved. I sailed the Caribbean a lot, the Mediterranean, the Baltic. I did one cruise. We were talking about the other day. We sailed 50 days from Athens to Bangkok through the Suez Canal, the same people. And my favorite part about that cruise, we had everything. It was Thanksgiving, it was Christmas, it was Hanukkah, it was New Year's. The people were so sick of each other. And the last 2 weeks, my parents came on board, and I was senior assistant cruise director of that ship. So everyone knew me. I used to introduce the shows. And my parents came on board. They were like the royalty. They're like, "Oh, you're Lisa's parents?" And I interviewed my dad. And he was like, "I'm not interesting. You can't interview me. What are we going to talk about?" So my dad does dental implants. I'm like, "Dad, these are your people." These people are going to be interested in implants. At the time, it was still kind of new. My dad was one of the first dentists in California to do implants. My dad's 83. He's still doing implants. But so I interviewed him, and it was, I've gotten a lot of great opportunities. We sailed in Asia. We did this. I remember Jennifer, who's here, Jennifer and I sailed on a ship. We sailed from San Francisco to Asia. And it was a World War II island cruise. And a lot of the people that came with us had fought in the war, and we went to the Marshall Islands, and we went to Midway. We were supposed to go to the Solomon Islands. That should have been the first time I went, but at the time they were shooting at ships, so we didn't go. And we went to a bunch of other places, but we had a lot of passengers that weren't that familiar with cruising. They came because of the itinerary. And so it was a challenging cruise in a lot of ways, and we had 5 sea days from San Francisco across. And we hadn't seen the sun. And so we called ourselves the Sunshine Girls. And one day our boss, the cruise director, was filming his morning TV show. So we came in our robes. He could see us, but the filming couldn't. We were like behind him. And we had pasted suns on our bathing suits. And we walked in and we flashed him and we walked out. We're like, we're the Sunshine Girls. And we were watching him on later. He was pounding on the desk. He's like, drowning puppies. He's like, you guys are never allowed in my room again. He used to lock the door.
Did you say drowning puppies?
He was trying to think of something sad because we had upset him. He was like, what's happening? So yeah, fun. We went
It
a lot
sounds
of
like
places.
it.
I mean, people always ask me, is cruising really like the show Below Decks? I'm like, well, it's mostly worse.
Okay.
But, I mean, it's like that, but more realistic.
Sure.
And Club Med, we did call it Club Bed for a reason. And, yeah, I mean.
And that reason was because it was a very tight community?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we shared a lot of things. A lot of friends were sharing a lot of other friends.
Sure. How big was the staff on these boats?
So when I worked, I was on, so Princess Cruises, I worked for Princess, Royal Caribbean, and Renaissance. When I first started at Princess I worked on the brand new Sun Princess. So now they have another ship that's the newer, brand new Sun Princess. But at the time when I worked, I think they had just gone to, we were like maybe 1,500 passengers. So we were probably like 700 or 800 crew. But when I first started, and one of the Jennifers that here was my very first roommate, she taught me everything. She was a very good teacher. And they were at the time, really not that many women worked on board. The dining room was all men. The housekeeping staff was all men. Now it's, I'd say, almost even, probably men and women on ships. But we walked down the hallway, and Princess is part of P&O at the time, and very British based. So the main thoroughfare on the bottom of the ship was called the M1, which I didn't know at the time was because there's an M1 in England. And the thoroughfare. And so we were walking down. We had joined 5 women to work in the kids program. And we hadn't even been on the ship an hour, and we were walking down, and someone was like, "Hey, Lisa," and I was like, "Oh my God," because there were 5 more women, so everyone knew who we were. So it was an adventure.
Sure. It sounds like it.
I
Absolutely.
recommend it. It was fun.
So between scuba and working on cruise ships, it sounds like that really encouraged that love of travel. And then you got into travel writing from there, is that correct? Or travel blogging, I guess you could say.
A little longer.
Okay.
So I worked on the ships until more or less till September 11th. And my company at the time, Renaissance Cruises, had borrowed in advance of that. And through a variety of reasons, within 7 days of September 11th, they were out of business. And that was a challenging time for everyone and very hard on the travel industry. So I left ships at that time. Well, I stayed a little bit longer. I cobbled together a little bit more. I worked back somewhere else. And then I went back to teaching. And then I was teaching and dating, and I met someone who also loved traveling. I worked for Princess, and he had been in the Peace Corps, which is, it's not really the same.
Sure.
They both
Traveling
start
in
with
very
P.
different ways, sure.
That was about it. But it was an adventure, and we went away for a year pretty early on, traveling around the world, and came home engaged. And what happened was I'd been teaching at a school where I was teaching science, and I taught every single kid in the school. And the kids were excited always to see me again the next year because my science class was pretty fun. Sometimes we made ice cream because that's a state change. You know, it's milk, it's a liquid, and then it's a solid, and it's tasty. So we had a lot of very fun projects. Anyway, so I had promised the kids that I would send newsletters. And I sent newsletters back, and the families would write to me and say that the kids were really interested. I talked about all the places that we met and being in Sri Lanka with the elephants, or being in Moorea and seeing the incredible volcanic islands. And while we were away on that trip, it was 2008, 2009, of course, that was when the crash of money happened. We came back, and then that blog revolution had begun. So that's when I first started writing. So I turned the newsletters into a blog, and from there I started writing for Technorati and all different kinds of places on the internet.
Gotcha. So you already had kind of the foundations of the blog going, and then the blog revolution happened, and so you kind of were able to just put that into that. Yeah.
Yep, make a website. I mean, I started on Blogger because my rules were it had to be free, and I didn't want a new password. Because at the time, we didn't have that many passwords. I know now, in 2025, that seems so ridiculous. But at the time, it seemed reasonable to fight to not have a new password.
So going back a little bit to, you said that you spent a year traveling with this
Yes.
new partner, who is called Fred in the book.
He is called Fred in the book.
So we're going to call him Fred here.
Yes.
So you and Fred spent a year traveling together. And where did you go to in that year?
We started out in French Polynesia and Australia, New Zealand area, but we spent most of the year in Southeast Asia because that was really important for our budget. I had made a science camp and gotten a lot of money, and Fred had money he'd been saving, and we set off on this adventure, and it seemed, in the beginning, it seemed great.
Sure. I mean, this is kind of exactly what you wanted to do, right? It was traveling around the world with a partner. It sounds like it was a different kind of traveling than what you were used to.
Oh my goodness, I had my first bucket bath.
Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes. We were in Vanuatu, staying in a village, and Fred was super excited because they had a Peace Corps worker, and I thought that was maybe a signal about the living conditions. And so they had a bucket bath. So you went in the bath room, house area, and had a big bucket of quite cold water, and you scooped out the bucket of water and poured it on yourself and soaped up and scooped more water. It was not hard to figure out. I just had never done it, and I hadn't anticipated. That never happened to me at Princess Cruises.
You guys didn't have bucket baths on Princess Cruises?
No, they never were like, listen, Lisa, we have no more water, so I'm just going to take this bucket and figure it out.
Sure.
And no, I wasn't upset about it. I just wasn't planning that was my, actually, I think that's not right. Fiji and Vanuatu we went to earlier. That was our first trip together. So that was my summer vacation. My romantic island vacation with my new boyfriend, I hadn't anticipated I'd be bucket bathing. So I learned a lot, and it was, there were ups and downs, and I did want to travel more, and at the time, it wasn't clear at the time, but the reason I had so many accidents, the reason I didn't understand all the scuba instructions, I had a problem with my eyes my whole life that never got diagnosed. And so I didn't always put everything together quite like other people. And in some ways, I think with my writing, it's actually been helpful that I don't see things the way other people see them, because it's been helped me to sell different stories. But in relationship, and if you're riding your bike, it's not always that helpful. And so, but yeah, I had the bucket bath. We had the 1 year adventure. During our adventure in Southeast Asia, we did get engaged. So we came back from that trip and got engaged. Or I came back to get married, actually.
Right. And then you guys started a blog together, correct?
We did start a travel site called We Said Go Travel, because Fred had this idea to work on a book that we wrote, He Said, She Said. It was a terrible book. It is sort of still exists on Amazon. He edited it all, and we don't talk about that book anymore. People always say to me, is Braveish your first book? I'm like, yes. It's not true, though.
So that's kind of your start with travel writing, right? With the newsletters
website,
to the blog to the
newsletters,
website.
the book that we don't talk about.
Yeah, the book that you don't talk about. So I guess it's not really your start. You'd been travel writing for a while.
Yeah. You just push that under the rug.
I mean, I think this book has had a lot more traction than that book. It certainly seems like.
This is a real book. This had an editor. It has a publisher. I have an agent.
What is it on Amazon on solo travel now?
So last week when I was on Spectrum News talking about my adventures to Antarctica, Braveish popped up to number 2 in the solo travel category, which for a book that's 16 months old was
pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And then how many awards have you won for this book at this point?
Oh my goodness. So I've won 10 awards. This is the first time I ever got a medal. This is from the North American Book Awards. This is my 9th award. And, because I was very clumsy, it was never in a sport. Like my first ribbon. Thank you. This one's for uplifting and inspirational nonfiction. And then the North American Book Awards, I think this one was for inspiration. I got a lot of awards. Very lucky. I mean, it's so shocking because honestly, when I was writing this book, the beginning of this book is about a very devastating, traumatic time in my life. My marriage, I tell people, your marriage has to end pretty badly to be a white Jewish girl from LA and get a traditionally published book, right? Like, it has to be pretty terrible. So writing about it was horrific, and I kept quitting. I was like, I'm never finishing this book. This is the worst idea. One of my friends took me out to lunch. She's like, Lisa, you don't have to write this book. It's really terrible watching you write this and be so upset. I'm like, okay, I'll quit. And I used to call my friend from high school. She's known me since I'm 12. She's a therapist. I used to call and leave these long messages on her voicemail. I'm quitting the book. It's so terrible. I'm crying all the time. I don't know why I'm doing this. And later she admitted she never listened to any of the messages. She just deleted them. She's like, I know you're going to finish the book. I'm like, wait, you're my friend? I need new friends.
I mean, you're the same person who wouldn't give up on scuba diving. So, of course, you're going to finish the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe I should have given up my marriage a little earlier, but, it's sometimes hard to know what's a good decision and
absolutely
what's the right choice. And so you do have to listen to your friends sometimes. And when I was getting divorced, and it was when we finally figured out, I had gone to Dr. Alan Brodney. He said, eye doctor here in Los Angeles, and he finally diagnosed me correctly what was wrong with my eyes. And I worked with him for a year doing vision therapy to correct that. And it was very shocking to find out that fixing what was physically wrong with my eyes really literally opened my eyes to ways that I was in relation to other people, not just in relation to falling down with my bicycle, causing problems for me. So it was quite, it was like my brain was a construction zone. You need a hard hat. It was very, very challenging. When you're 7, if they catch it, they're not rerouting everything. And vision therapy was probably, besides writing this book, the hardest thing I've ever done.
Really?
Just committing to it. I did stuff every single day. I went every week. He was shocked after the first 10 weeks when he retested me. He said, I know you've been working really hard because this is quite impressive progress. Like I used to say to people, one of the things that came up was he said to me something about 3D movies. I was like, people love those 3D movies. I just don't get it. Then I was like, wasn't it great when that thing came out at you? And I'm like, no, I didn't see that at all. That was because I couldn't. I literally didn't see 3D very much at all. Mm-hmm. And was actually part of my homework. I went to 3D movies and 4D movies. And then after that, during kind of in the middle of my vision therapy, I was on a cruise as a journalist, and we went to the Sistine Chapel. And I was like, oh, that is amazing. And I was really thankful that I had never been before, because I would not have appreciated it. Like, I really didn't see things the same.
Sure.
And I do think, fortunately, sometimes I have a hard head and I stay in it. Like you said, I stayed with the scuba diving. I stayed with the writing. I finished the book. But it's all been in little steps that,
Sure.
They say fall down 7, get up 8. And, I basically fall down 893 million times. But, I'm been very determined.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's very clear in the book.
Thank you.
And, this book talks about a lot of this stuff, and you have such a vibrant and bright and beautiful personality, and this book is, like all of those awards say, very inspiring and very uplifting. But there's definitely some very heavy subject matter in the book that we've kind of touched on so far. And it even starts with you in a very traumatic place where you're actually laying on the pavement in Thailand. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about where this book starts?
Yes. So the last day I ever saw my ex-husband, he pushed me to the ground in the street. And I literally didn't know if I would ever get up, because I didn't know right away. I didn't know, like, was something in me broken? I mean, my heart was for sure broken, but I was in that moment thinking, like, are my parents going to collect me, like, from the hospital? Am I paralyzed? I could be dead. And I did get up, and we started screaming at each other in the street in Chiang Rai, in this, tiny, tiny town far in the north of Thailand. And I could see these two men. And I started thinking to myself, if those two men call the police because these crazy American tourists are having a fight in the street, I was like, which one of us would they take to jail? And I was like, I'm pretty sure it'd be me, because it's not a place that's so much about women's rights. And I was in danger just in so many ways. And it was very terrifying. It was very terrible. But it was interesting. I mean, at that time, I went back to my hotel room, and I literally was on Skype around the clock as the world turned. I was calling people in different places. I had friends in China, and I had friends in the US, and I had friends different places, and I just kept calling people and trying to figure out what was I going to do. And my friend Carl, who I met the very first day of college, I called Carl, hysterical, and his kids he had teenage boys at the time, and he said, there have to be consequences. And I was like, I do not know what to do. And he's like, he can't stay with you. And, when he comes back to the hotel, you tell him he can't stay there, and then you'll call me again. And it was just baby steps. Like, I'm alone, I'm now alone in Thailand. And my one friend, I remember that we had a call for like 20 minutes. It turns out we were on the phone for like 3 or 4 hours, and she was saying to me, if I buy you a plane ticket, will you get on the plane? I'm like, what? Where am I going? She's like, you're coming home. I'm like, why am I leaving Thailand? She's like, will you get on the plane? I'm like, I'm not getting on a plane. She goes, then I'm coming to Thailand. I'm like, why are you coming to Thailand? I was like in the game of who's on first. When whose wife picks up the check. And she was like, if you're not getting on the plane, I'm coming to get you. And I was like, okay, that seems dumb. I'll get on the plane. I literally came home because I thought it was stupid for her to fly to Thailand for no reason. And then we started from there. And then I called another friend of mine, and she's like, I've known you a very long time, and I want to explain something to you. On Monday, this is not going to be fixed. This is not a weekend problem. And she's like, we're going to make a 2-day plan, then we're going to make a 2-week plan, then we're going to make a 2-month plan. And I was like, I want to go back to Thailand. She's like, you're not going anywhere. And it was really hard. Like, my brain just couldn't figure it out. I was like so lost and disoriented and overwhelmed. And I think you feel that in the beginning of the book, that it just, it was really hard. Just to think about all the ways that things had been bad for a long time. And he used to say to me, I was actually thinking about this week, because I'm home now from Thailand, is 11 years this week. And
Saturday, is that correct? Or no, earlier
this weekend.
This weekend, yeah.
He used to always say to me, nobody wants to work with you. And when I was the first year being without him, I just kept thinking that all the time. He was like, nobody wants to work with you. It's all you. You're the problem. And I'm just back from going to Antarctica, and I'm like, I think people want to work with me now. So, but it was a struggle to figure out, like, what was I going to do with my life? And was I going back to teaching? Could I go on the road by myself? And it turned out a lot of the choices I made in my life, I always wanted to travel, but I traveled in a very specific way. I worked on the cruise ship. One of the reasons that I traveled that way in such a structured environment, and why it was so good for me, I didn't know at the time, was it was an accommodation for my eyes. There's only so much that I could manage. And, Fred was a backpacker. I would never have traveled that way by myself. And I really probably couldn't have, just given all the things that were challenging for me, that I accommodated in different ways. And in fairness, part of the reason I left medicine was it was the first time I couldn't accommodate out what was wrong with my eyes. Histology class and anatomy class was I finally went far enough in education where I just couldn't fake it. Yeah. Like, my eyes couldn't figure it out. But we never knew why until when I was getting divorced.
So you mentioned Fred was a backpacker, and you wouldn't have traveled like that because you couldn't, because of the complications.
It would have been hard
eyes.
for me.
Yeah. Do you think that being with Fred made you feel like that was something that you could do, that you were capable of doing, and that's part of the reason why it was so hard to leave?
You know, it's so complicated when you're in a relationship with someone crazy. You know, to like tease all the pieces out. Like there were things that I did love him so much, and I never would have chosen backpacking on my own. I learned a lot. Like I love that I trekked in Nepal. I hate that we went on a trek where we made a lot of bad choices. We lived, but there was one day where it was snowy and icy, and our choice about why we would make it was completely backward logic that made sense anyway. But I'm thrilled that I did it. You know, we traveled overland between China and Mongolia. We did a lot of amazing things. I've been, you know, we were talking about scuba diving. I dove in Vanuatu to 130 feet, and you know, on the incredible wreck dive, and you know, I've had a lot of amazing opportunities that came about, but I wouldn't have picked that traveling by myself.
Yeah,
no.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, you know, that there were a lot of things that happened before that, and even in your first trip with Fred, which was a local trip to San Luis Obispo, you write in the book that it was a series of like terrible things happening, and you write that you began to overlook what was actually happening in the hopes that things could be better somewhere else. And I think, you know, one thing that I was thinking about when I was reading the book is that travel can be so isolating, and abuse can be so isolating, or abuse, it feeds off of isolation, and those kind of relationships that are toxic feed off of isolating that other person. Do you think that there's an element of that lifestyle that perpetuated that situation and kind of kept it going?
Yes,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Being on the road, if we had not been on the road, I mean, it's so hard to know like which thread you pull out of the sweater makes it unravel. But one of the things that helped me be ready to leave, although obviously there was a huge drama that was the last day, we stayed with someone we had met in Koh Samui, and I remember we stayed there because she had great Wi-Fi and her husband was away and they had space and whatever. Anyway, she said to me, "You can stay here again. He can never come back." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. Tell me more." And she said, "You know, when I carried the water in, he didn't offer to help. And when I did this, he didn't offer to help. And you're working all day on the website, and he's playing games on his phone, and you're helping me with the dinner, and he's not." And she's like, "I just don't like it." And I was like, "Huh, that's interesting." And so I think, you know, to speak to being isolated, like when no one's there as a sounding board, and you don't know when you're traveling, you pick up people. Like there were people that we traveled with in Brunei that we saw again in Laos. Like, you know, on the backpacker trail, you run into people, or you try to. And you know, so a lot of them were much younger than us, and so they probably maybe wouldn't have said anything. But you know, if you're home, people might say something. Although once I was getting divorced, everybody had an opinion. You know, "Oh, well, you know, I never liked him." I'm like, you know, that's not really helpful right now.
Right.
Thanks. I don't like him either. I was like, "Thanks. We agree. You don't like him. I don't like him. He's not here. Why are we talking about him?" But so I personally, the woman that said something to me, that really made a difference in my life. And so I've made a commitment when I have an opinion about someone's relationship. I have had conversations with people where I say, "Listen, I don't want this to be the last time we ever see each other, but I need to tell you something." And it is, for a lot of people, scary that maybe they'll lose a friendship. And it's in my book, and one of my friends had said to me, she said, "It's not true. In Jewish marriage, you don't say 'till death do you part.'" But anyway, she said to me, "You know, in the wedding, you say 'till death do us part,' not until he kills you." And I was like, yeah, that's pretty helpful. You know, like it's pretty basic.
Yeah.
And you know, we talk about sometimes low bar. That's pretty low bar. But it is, the isolation doesn't give people the opportunity, although I think people are hesitant to tell you something. When I was very heavy at one point in my life, a lot of people made the effort to explain to me that no, they didn't want to say anything when you're heavy. They're like, nobody wants to tell you you're fat. Mm-hmm. But when I came back from the trip with Fred, the first trip, I was like, I think 108 pounds. I had lost so much weight because he was very controlling. That's a sign. And tried to manage my food. That's another sign. And anyway, everybody at my school was like, why don't you eat a cupcake? You look, blow away in the wind. And I just thought it was so interesting when people feel comfortable to say, like, you're too skinny, but they don't want to say something else. And when the relationship's not going well, like, all the people who are like, I never liked him. Thanks, it's so helpful now. He's gone. But I do think it's important to mention, because I think that when you see someone else in a situation that's literally dangerous, and most people don't know how dangerous it is.
Sure.
They, when they say about the airport, see something, say something, that works for relationships too.
Do you think that if more people had told you that at the time, that would have changed the direction that things were going?
It's so hard to know which is the thing that is literally like the straw that breaks the camel's back, but I think it's important to try, and I don't know if I would have listened or not.
Sure.
I want to say that I would have, but I don't know if it's true.
Sure, you never know. So after that incident, and you kind of talked about this a little bit, but I also want to kind of go back and talk about it more. You found yourself on the ground in Thailand, and then you had to navigate getting out of this abusive relationship alone in a foreign country. And how did you navigate that?
Not well. I had actually a hotel stay in Chiang Mai. They were hosting me for an article. Mm-hmm. So Fred was gone. I took the bus for a couple hours to get back. I checked in the hotel, and I think it looked like I think I cried the whole time. Mm-hmm. And I basically hid in my room. I put my robe on, and I went to 7-Eleven, because in Thailand, 7-Eleven's everywhere. And I ate cheese sandwiches in my room. And I called my friends on Skype, and my friend bought me a ticket, literally bought me a ticket, and I came back, and I stayed at my friend's house for a couple nights here in LA. And then I stayed with my parents, and there was a lot of therapy. I mean, I live in Los Angeles, and you know what? There's a lot of kinds of therapy here, and I did all of them. Mm-hmm. Everything. I did the therapy where you hit the box with the tennis racket, and screaming. I went to pole dancing class. That wasn't exactly therapy, but it was something.
Was it therapeutic, though?
Huh?
Was it therapeutic, though?
It was fun.
Yeah.
And I went to talk therapy. I did anything anyone recommended to me. Someone told me you cannot do new things in an old way. Mm-hmm. That was why I went to pole dancing class. It was a place, they had 7 days. The first week was free, and they had classes all day long. So I went every single day for like 3 hours. And my friend's boyfriend said, on the 7th day, they're going to give you flowers. I said, why are they going to give me flowers? He said, they're going to be so glad you're gone. But I was trying new things, and then it was such a hard time. I remember I went to dance class, and I came home and I cried. And my dad's like, why are you crying? Oh, they were so nice to me. And he's like, you're crying because they were nice? I'm like, I don't know, yes. So it was a hard time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a hard time, but then one of my therapists had recommended Dr. Brodney, and I had started on the eye therapy, and that gave me like a goal. And Dr. Brodney actually thought that I was doing so well. He's like, you're really doing such a good job with your therapy. You're really doing more things. I think you need a challenge. And I was like, nope, I do not need a challenge. He said, I think you should have tennis lessons. I was like, that is a terrible idea. So I found a tennis teacher, someone in my neighborhood who was really good at tennis, had this fancy tennis teacher who happened to also teach children. And I figured I was about as good as like a 5-year-old. So I was like, I need a children's teacher. So I went and I had lessons, and I wish I had video of this too. My teacher said to me, Lisa, I just have a question for you. What is it that you're watching? Because it is not the ball. I was like, it doesn't seem like I'm doing a good job. He's like, well, there's room for improvement. It turned out I was great at serving, though. That was surprising. And I did that for a while. And then I met this woman who, on a press trip in Grapevine, Texas, and she was turning 40, and she was doing this project, 40 Things Before She Turned 40. And there were maybe like 8 or 10 women on this trip. It was a weekend trip before a conference. And we did drinking and dancing and painting and all this stuff. And every time she was talking about it, 40 Things Before 40, I was like, oh, it's such a good idea. It's such a good idea. And all the women on the trip, it was a girlfriend getaway. All the women, why don't you do that? And I was like, oh, I simply cannot. And finally, on the third day, this woman who was older than me looks at me and she says, can you not do it because you're over 40? And I was like, yep, that's why I cannot. And she said, why don't you do 50 things before you're 50? And I said, why don't you do 60 before you're 60? And she said, I'm never doing 60 things before I'm 60. I don't want anyone to know how old I am. I'm like, why do I want the people to know I'm going to be 50? She says, oh, maybe I'll do 25 things before my 25 years of marriage. I'm like, yeah, go do that. So anyway, at the conference, I was like, all right, I'll test it out. And so I said to the first woman, I'm like, hey, I'm thinking about doing this project, 50 things before I'm 50. She goes, you're almost 49? And I said, yes. And she said, oh, I'm so inspired. I'm like, why are you inspired? She goes, because I'm 29 turning 30 and I think my life is over. So if you're 49 and you can still do things outside by yourself, there's hope for me. And that's how the 50 Things Before 50 started, because I was like, that's all it takes to be inspiring. Sign me up. And so as I went around the room at this travel conference, people were like, oh, what you could do this? And I was like, oh, no, I'm definitely not doing that. It's a terrible idea. It's scary. And this woman looked at me and said, isn't that the idea of your project? I was like, please don't use my words against me. And so that's basically how my whole 50 Things challenge got started.
Gotcha.
That I was reinventing myself through trying new things, because I just kept going with this idea you couldn't do new things in an old way. Mm-hmm. And I had to do something. I was like, I don't know what to do with my life. And I was teaching, and I wanted to travel, and I was trying not to cry everywhere. Actually, I did cry everywhere. But I was on a press trip, and we were in Italy. And we went on the gondola ride, which, is typically this very boyfriend, girlfriend, married, engagement, romance trip. And we were on the trip. It was me and a few other girls. We were in the gondola. We had the best time. And none of us gave it any thought that we weren't in a relationship. We went on the gondola. The guy sang to us. It was awesome. We get out of the gondola, and someone else from our trip was like, oh my gosh, you have to come. You have to come. She's crying. And I'm like, okay. And so there were 2 people on our trip that were in the middle of getting divorced. And so we took her out, and we were trying to help her. Anyway, I went back to my room that night, and I was like, oh my God, I wasn't the one crying. It was this huge moment for me. I was getting better. Mm-hmm. And the funny thing is, those 2 people that were both getting divorced, they actually recently got married. So you never know what's going to happen. Everyone who was crying found another way. But, it's just the small steps. I just kept going. I did the 50 things. I didn't necessarily think it would be a book. I just did the 50 things to kind of keep myself grounded and going. And eventually I did think about writing a book, and I pitched the book, and I met with a bunch of New York agents, and they're like, oh, no. 50 Things Before 50 is not a book. Because it's not 50 things. It's not 1,000 places to see before you die. That's for everybody. Or 100 places to see in Seattle. This 50 things is very specific to me, my eyes and my relationship and getting better. So the only way this book was a book is if you start with your divorce. And I was like, oh, that's a deal breaker. I'm definitely not writing about my divorce. So I put the project away. And then I just kept thinking about it. And anyway, I found a developmental editor, and I'd been working on the outline. And then probably none of you have ever heard of this, but then there was this thing called COVID. And
sounds kind of familiar.
It's kind of familiar?
Yeah.
Okay. And so there was, I have someone who has issues with health, and so there was no traveling for me. And in the end, I was home more than 400 days in Los Angeles, which for me was a long time. But there was a lot of writing. So I worked on the book. I found my agent during COVID. I sold the book to a publisher during COVID, and it was actually surprising, quite productive time for me. And it's a funny thing about this book that when your subtitle is One Breakup, Six Continents, you really want to go to the next continent. So that was part of the whole book tour was, could I get to Antarctica? So,
Sure, which you just did.
yeah, in January. So I had the best time.
Yeah. And I do want to get to Antarctica, but I want to go back to the 50 things a little bit and talk about the ones that are in the book. Because your first one,
Phoebe,
tell us about that.
You did a very close read of my book. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's talk about your first one.
Okay.
How did you decide on that one?
I didn't actually decide. So I was at lunch with a friend of mine who I met in Israel when I was on the first cruise that we talked about. My parents took us to the Mediterranean. One of the places we went was in Israel. And it was my first time in Israel. And it was so great to be there with my family. And I really wanted to go again. So I ended up doing a team tour. And one of the friends that I made, there were a whole bunch of us went from Los Angeles. So I met her when I was 15. I was out to lunch with her, and I was telling her I might do this project, 50 challenges before I turn 50. She says, why don't you start right now? I'm like, no, we don't need to start right now. And she says, right now we're going to start, and you're going to try sushi. And I was like, nope, it's not what's going to happen. And I had food allergies, and so I was very not interested in trying new things. She's like, I'm going to order it, and you're going to try it. And that's how it started. But apparently, in hindsight, all my friends bossed me around. And I listened. And so I was like, this can't be in my 50 things. It's too little. And she's like, everything starts small. And that really became a theme kind of some of the challenges. I mean, I worked up. By the time I got to the 50th challenge, I did jump out of a perfectly well-maintained airplane. But I wasn't sure that would ever happen.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like you said, it's not always about taking the biggest leap. It's just about doing it, taking that first step.
Yeah, not giving up.
Absolutely. How did you decide on the things? Did they come to you most of the time? Did you go out and seek them? How did you decide which things would be these 50 new things that you were trying?
Well, in fairness, I actually had a list of 80, and my developmental editor and I worked with it because she was like, Lisa, every single chapter can't be scuba diving. I was like, scuba diving is amazing. Every chapter can have scuba diving. She's like, no, people, even scuba divers don't want to read all and scuba diving. But it's enough. So what happened was really basically bossy people. And things got offered to me, different stories like the Solomon Islands story. I had this opportunity with Smithsonian Magazine. Some of them were parts of other things. I had a family member say, as part of the 50 things, maybe you could get to your 100th country. So that was a goal. And because I'd been on the ship so long, my cousin said to me, well, maybe you should look for some landlocked countries. You probably haven't been there. And so I did that. I went to San Marino in Italy, and I went, Monaco's not landlocked, but I went to some smaller countries that weren't on the route of cruising or my cruises. And they just kind of developed, it would be a lot of times someone would pitch me for a story, and at the time, everything was about craft beer at the time. And I'm like, listen, you want a craft beer story? I will introduce you to my friend who does that. I said, I'm looking for an adventure. And here's some of the things I've done recently. And they're like, oh, well, if you've done that, maybe you want to do this. Or I went on a skiing trip, and I was with the team in Lake Tahoe, and at North Star Lake Tahoe, they asked me, will you come back in the summer and do pumps and pedals? And I was like, I don't know what that means. She's like, we have this women's bike club. And I was like, oh no, I'm not coming back for biking. That's a terrible idea. And she said, no, I really want you to. And I was like, you can want all you want. And she's like, are you just scared? I'm like, there's no way I'm mountain biking. That is a terrible idea. And so finally, this kept going. I don't know why she really wanted me to do the story, but she did. And I sold it to Pop Sugar, and it was a great story, but I was sure I was going to die. But so I said to her, jokingly, I said, I'll come if you get me a private lesson with a teacher that doesn't mind crying. because I thought that would be the end of the story. I thought she would drop it. And so unfortunately, I did cry. They promised me we would be only on green runs. And I was so bad, I had to have a second instructor, which is a theme you might have noticed from the scuba diving. Anyway, at one point, Shep says to me, Lisa, I'm just trying to expand your comfort zone. You know, your comfort zone is like this, and I think you can do it. He's like, have you fallen on the bike? Have you been scared on the bike? Have you whatever? And I was like, oh my God, Shep, this project is not to do things until I die. It's supposed to be 50 things, it's supposed to be joyous. Anyway, so I did mountain bike on a blue run, and it was awesome, but it was terrifying.
Sure. It sounds like a lot of these things, when they come to you, your first reaction is absolutely not. How do you get yourself from absolutely not to, yes, I'm doing this?
When I was writing the book, I noticed that no matter what anyone offered me, my first response was absolutely not. And the thing that was interesting is, since I did these 50 things, one of the things we have for giveaway is City Pass. And when I was in Toronto using City Pass, I went to the CN Tower. And while I was there, I saw that you could walk around the outside. And I was like, oh my God, walk around the outside of the CN Tower, sign me up. And I was like, wait, I'm not scared. I didn't say no. So it definitely changed me doing all of these things. And how did I get to not giving up? Honestly, I don't know. I feel like there was a part of me that was willing to be more adventurous than the part of me that was scared. Mm-hmm. But, you know, one of the things that happened with the skydiving, which was, you know, really late in the 50 things, was my last thing. I showed up for the skydiving, and anybody that's been skydiving would know that if there's clouds, you can't go. So when I showed up for the skydiving, they're like, oh, we're on a cloud hold. And I was like, that's great, I will leave. They're like, no, it's probably just 15 minutes and then we're gonna go. Well, it turned out to be a 2-hour hold, which meant I had 120 minutes to decide my choice was a bad choice, which was a long time for me because I was so scared. So my instructor, the tandem instructor, was talking to me about my project, and I had just been scuba diving with bull sharks. I went to shark school in Mexico. And he looks at me and he says, I would never scuba dive with sharks. And I said, you wouldn't? He goes, no, it's a terrible idea. I'm like, you think that sharks are scary? And he said, yes. And I said, they pay you to jump out of a plane. That's your job. And up until that point in my brain, I always thought there were people like me who were scared and people like him who were brave. And it never occurred to me that, like, people could be scared and brave, or they could be scared and change their mind. Like, I always thought that scared and brave was like a light switch. It was on or off. And for me, it was off. I was scared. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that's not how it is. And it was very helpful for me. And I don't think he ever went scuba diving, but I did jump out of the plane. I mean, I was strapped to him. I didn't really have a choice. Once they opened the door, I was going. Mm-hmm. But I did like it. I have not rushed back, but
but you did it, and you liked it.
And so some of it is, you know, I think it's like a lot of us have a little bit of a war, you know, in ourselves. Like, oh, I hate my boss, I hate my job, but I can't give it up. But somehow people then decide, like, actually, I'm going to quit my job and start my own company, or I'm going to start a little side project and hope it'll grow. Or, you know, maybe this year I can only go as far as San Diego, but I hope next year I'm going to Baja. You know, people change their lives in honesty in very small steps, and that's what's made the difference for me. All the early things were pretty small challenges, and you know, I think that in the book that if I could have called myself on my 50th birthday after jumping out of the plane to my 49th self and said, here's what's going to happen, I would have definitely hung up. I would have been like, this is a crank call. Because there's no way I am doing those things. But, and that's been one of the issues about the title of the book, is my best friend and my mom are furious, like, you're not brave-ish. You're brave. And I'm like, but that's not the point. Mm-hmm. The point is I didn't feel brave.
Sure.
And when I first left my husband, people kept saying to me, oh, you're so brave. It happened so many times I actually looked the word up in the dictionary, because I was like, I don't think this word means what you think it means. I felt like, like inconceivable, right? You're like, I don't think you're using that word correctly, because this is not a brave person. And so I think the part of it was like coming into that I already made brave choices. Choosing to leave medical school for me was necessary. It didn't fit, but it was also, really stepping off the track. When I left med school and when I worked for Club Med, my mom was telling her friends, she said this isn't true, but she told her friends I ran away with the circus. And I was like, that's really not very nice. So they came to visit me in Eleuthera, and I was in the trapeze show. So, maybe I did run away with the circus, but it worked out. But it was, you just never know. When you hear that little voice, like I remember I was going back for the next semester of school, and I heard this little voice. I was like, do not make me go back there. Mm-hmm. And, it's hard to decide which voice do you listen to, and, which steps you take. And I remember writing the book, and it was, like I said, so hard. I used to write until I thought I was going to throw up, and then I would lay on the floor. And in the end, writing the book, if it never got published, if no one ever read it, if it never won an award, if it, and nothing ever happened, it was worth it because I needed it. I had a lot to work through, and writing for me really helped work through all those things. But sometimes you have to take a chance.
Sure, absolutely. And it sounds like you've taken a lot of chances.
Maybe more than my share.
And it sounds like they've worked out very well. So you're still doing new things to this day. You just went to Antarctica.
Yes.
You're potentially setting world records.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what else you're doing these days post the book? Are you going to do a 60 before 60 now?
So my publisher asked me about a next book, and we've been joking that my next book's called Relentless, because my publisher and my agent, they say they don't have any other author who's of any level, debut or multiple book, with so many awards and so many press hits. So I've been on TV so much, and I've had so many interviews, and I told her I would consider the title Relentless as long as the subtitle says, but in a good way. But this book doesn't have anything about the journey of the book, like getting an agent, getting the publisher, what happened. And I have done a lot of new things. Like you said, I did go to Antarctica with Quark Expeditions on the Ultramarine, and that ship has 2 helicopters, so I got to fly over the ice.
And I think we might even have a video of that.
Oh, we might.
I think. If we can. It sounds like it.
Sometimes they ruin again. The helicopter was so much fun.
Was that first time in a helicopter?
No, my first time in a helicopter in Antarctica.
There you go.
But no, they so Quark has a program where everyone on the Ultramarine gets the opportunity to fly. Mm-hmm. So on this expedition, we went in the Zodiac cruising. We did Zodiac landings. There were so many ways to see the creatures. I mean, we had really an incredible expedition. We had great weather. We saw 3 kinds of penguins. We saw chicks, we saw eggs, we saw the Adelie, the Gentoo, we saw the chinstrap. I mean, this place that, I don't know if that's picture still showing for you, the fast ice. We walked on the fast ice, and you said I have a world record attempt. So my expedition, we went south of the Antarctic Circle, and we walked on the fast ice, and I got to hula hoop on the fast ice. So I'm doing a Guinness Book World Record attempt for hula hooping south of the Antarctic Circle. And then also on this expedition, I had not one, but 2 polar plunges. One was accidental. So we went.
And we might even have a video of that too.
Yes, we have a little stand-up paddleboarding for you. So the stand-up paddleboarding, you wear a dry suit. And I have to say, for all the things that I've done, I was getting dressed in my dry suit on my expedition ship in Antarctica thinking, I signed up for stand-up paddleboarding in Antarctica. I'm not even a good stand-up paddleboarder in the Caribbean. But they convinced me they have these wide boards and they're very stable. And like, you'll be fine, Lisa. I'm like, oh, great. So I enjoyed stand-up paddleboarding. One of the things that's so nice is in the Zodiac, you're quite close to everything. And we went on, all these landings. But the stand-up paddleboarding is so quiet. And we saw a seal. And then I fell down twice. And I fell down the first time into my board, which is jarring. But then I fell down back. But we do have, I don't know if you have the video, but yeah, I made the video funny because we fell down and then we stood back up.
And so this was your first polar plunge, is that correct?
This is my unintended polar plunge.
Your practice polar
I
plunge.
fell off the board. It's like the gloves got wet, the hat got wet. They gave me new gloves. I did a little editing magic. It's funnier if you get back up. That was not easy. That was fun though.
Ooh, careful.
The woman that was filming, she was really good stand-up paddleboarder. And she didn't speak very much English, though. She was the translator. There was some people on board who only spoke Chinese, and she was the translator. And so when you go over the ice in your stand-up paddleboard, it's not very stable. It was a small, anyway, I'm not that great at it, so I fell down. But I loved when I was editing the video, you can hear her going, be careful. And I'm like, would it be more helpful if she said, walk forward? I needed like a clue. So that was my unintended polar plunge. And then later we got back on the ship after we went stand-up paddleboarding. And, on an expedition ship, for everyone who's been on an expedition ship, you don't exactly know what's going to happen. They think like, oh, this is going to happen. And so they were amazing with the stand-up, with the polar plunge. I think 108 people out of 177 actually did a plunge. They were doing port and starboard. They have you on a rope, and it was amazing. So 2 different people filmed me, and so I have footage. It's very funny. Right before I jumped in, one of the guys screamed out, "Where's your hula hoop?" Because I'd hula hooped across the Antarctic Circle. I'd hula hooped on the fast ice. So I have the Guinness record that I attempt for the hula hooping on the fast ice. And then this was actually my second polar plunge in 6 months. I did 2 different walking safaris with Churchill Wild where I walked with the polar bears, and I did a polar plunge in the Arctic. So I put in a Guinness Book World Record attempt, so we'll see what happens. It takes about 12 weeks to hear and get the next step. So who knows what'll happen?
We'll find out soon, but we
find
could be
out.
sitting here with a world record holder.
We'll see. I mean, it turns out there's quite a lot of things you can attempt. But I love the polar plunge. I did feel kind of great before I got in the water because I was like, I've already been in the water today. But I forgot that under my dry suit, I was wearing, my pants with the flannel lining and my jacket and my base layer and my thermal layer. And I did get wet because my seal was too tight, so I had put something under the seal. So of course my jacket got wet because that was not my smartest choice. But I was like, it won't be that bad. And I jumped in the water with just my bathing suit on. Holy Moses, is freezing. And so when I got out of the water, I said something to the guy about it. That was really cold. And in one of the videos, you can hear a guy say, what do you think it was going to be? It's Antarctica. And but we had great weather. Every day was mostly like 31 or 32 degrees. And, what do they say? There's no cold weather. There's just bad clothing. Mm-hmm. And so it was really my dream come true. When I worked on the cruise, many years ago working on the ships, we didn't at the time go to Antarctica. And I've always wanted to go, and I've been on expedition in the Galapagos, and standing on the ice with my new friends, and everybody on the expedition. I was by myself, but I got invited. I went to 2 different birthday parties. I went to an anniversary party. They were, everyone was so friendly, and just seeing all the babies. That was my favorite thing, seeing the babies up close. And this is the Fabrice, the penguinologist. He's an ornithologist, but they call him penguinologist. He helped me hula hoop. I hula hooped at the southernmost post office in the world on Des Moines Island. And you can hear there's 44 videos. I have already 45 minutes full of videos. You can watch the whales and the ice. And anyway, you can hear Fabrice when I'm hula hooping. And he's French, and he's going, "You can do better than this." And I was like, "Do you want to turn?" He's like, "No, you can do better than this." I'm like, "Thank you for your help, hula hoopologist." But it was really fun, and it was just very joyful. And we did, of course, we were going down, had Drake Lake. Coming back, we had Drake Shake. They told us they thought it would be 6-meter seas, but we had 7 to 8-meter seas.
Wow.
Yeah, so, we're shaking.
Are you used to that kind of experience from your time working on cruise ships, or is this different than anything you ever experienced on cruise ships?
The 7 to 8-meter swell?
Mm-hmm.
That is extreme.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was in a hurricane once in the Caribbean, but we were able to skirt most of it. We just went further south.
Mm-hmm.
But that's definitely the heaviest seas I've been in. When I thought it was 6 meters, actually wrote to one of the Jennifers who's here tonight, and I was like, 6-meter seas? And she's like, "Don't be a hero. I know you. Take the medicine." So I did. I took the medicine. Thank you, Jennifer. That's why you need your bossy friends. Come on. I sometimes need someone to help me.
So I want to open it up to the audience for questions in just a minute here, but I also want to ask you, you have a travel writing course, is that correct?
I have a travel writing course.
Mm-hmm. And it's right here, Travel Writer 101.
Travel Writer 101, yes. A lot of people say to me, "How can I travel like you? Mm-hmm. How can I get started?" And a number of the travel writers and content creators that I know have courses. Like one of my editors from Travel and Leisure, she and another very fantastic writer have a writing course. But I feel like there was a piece missing in that. My course is more, I would say, when you go out to dinner, you order all appetizers. That's my course. This is basics. So it's the basics about writing, video, photography, press trips. Mm-hmm. I call it a taster. That, people say to me, "Oh, my sister-in-law's brother's neighbor's friend's child wants to be a writer. Can you go have coffee with her?" I'm like, "No, but I will give you my class." Because people don't understand. Even just looking at the list of all the topics in this course, someone who said to me, "Oh, I really want to do this." I gave them the course, and they called back, "I actually don't want to do this." And I was like, it is a lot of work. Between, for the Antarctica, for example, I have 44 videos so far. They're mostly reels, so under a minute. But 44 is not nothing, and I'm not done. And then I have to take those and turn them into articles. And then I also, I have a story. I was on Spectrum News talking about them. So there's a lot of pieces to manage, and it's amazing, but it is some work. So,
Absolutely.
But yeah, so I have that. That's been a fun new project. That's on Udemy.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, let's open it up to the audience. Does somebody want to walk around with the mic? Thank you, David. All right.
Thank you, David.
I think you just need to put it really close to your face.
Test.
I would love to know what you consider to be the scariest of all of your challenges.
That's such a good question. I get asked that a lot. What's my scariest challenge? And for me, the scariest challenge was the mountain biking, because the skydiving is very scary. But the thing about skydiving is, if anything happens, it's not your fault. You're tandem to someone who's in charge. And a lot of the challenges that I did, there was some like guardrails or help. And the mountain bike to me felt really the most scary, because even though, like I said, I had a second instructor, they're in front and behind you. They can't stop you from falling. So that to me felt like the most kind of out there. And because of the accident I had when I told you in the 70s, I did a backflip with my bike and landed on my head with no helmet. I think I had the most like trauma, fear in my body, besides the swimming, which I'd worked out that already that I could swim. I felt a little bit. I didn't feel in danger because, like I said, they were helping me, but that was for me the scariest one.
Yeah, quick question about the writing. I like to keep travel logs when I travel, but they're like my diaries, and I like to go back. But I'm like, no one would ever want to read my writing; it's horrible. But I like it. So what's different about travel writing than just good writing in general? Is there something unique about travel writing?
That's a good question. So first of all, people would like to read what you wrote. And I also tell people when you get started, like when I started my site, you don't have to be that good. Nobody's reading it. In the beginning, your audience is like, or if you're lucky, most people, it's like you and your mom or you and your spouse. And you'd be surprised how interesting you are to other people. I often tell people who say, I want to travel like you. I can't afford it. I can't go for that long. Like, most people around the world have Los Angeles on their list as a destination bucket list. So one year I did a project where every month I went to a different museum here in LA. Because when I travel around the world, I go to museums. But I don't always make time to go to museums here. So it's hard to know, it's hard to have good perspective of like, is my writing interesting? Is my city interesting? So the difference between travel writing and other writing, it depends who you ask. Like an editor at Bloomberg told me that I couldn't write this story because I can't think of the word. What was the word? I'm too something.
The raffle tickets.
It doesn't matter. But there's a space in the internet for every kind of writing. So someone else is too gushy. Thank you. I'm too gushy, which is true. I'm very gushy, and they're like data. But Anne say that, or a woman who knows me. It was fair. It's actually fair. It's thank you for being upset on my behalf, but it was fair. But it could have been bad. Oh, they were upset. Anyway, there's a place for everything. Like scuba diving centric, people want to know how did you do it, or backpacking, or I'm going to film in DC, and then I have to go see someone in Philly, and I was Googling like, from this weird place I have to be in Virginia, how do I get on the train? So if you had a blog about how do you get, the easy way to make this happen, someone needs that information. So you'd be surprised how interested people are. And travel depends who you are. I think that Mishner said that travel writing started when someone was like, hey, what's over that hill? What is discovery?
Cave painting.
Cave painting. Okay, yeah, but it was maybe before what's over the hill.
So I'm fascinated by this concept of vision therapy.
Yes.
I'm just curious to know what that entails. And it sounds, if you could go a little bit into what your personal experience was like, 'cause it seems as if you went through a sort of paradigm shift in the way that you lived your own life. So can you go into detail a little bit about that?
Sure. That's a good question, actually, because it was not like making a vision board. It wasn't like a woo-woo experience. I grew up with the intermittent left esotropia, which is more commonly known sometimes as a lazy eye, but I did not have it consistently. I had it inconsistently. So it's hard to accommodate. And so one of the main issues is that my eyes had to learn to team to work together. And when your eyes don't team, there's an issue, is the depth perception is a huge issue, but there's an issue if the feed of the eye isn't being listened to, is the brain still getting the information? And so the doctor told me if my brain and my eye were still talking, he could help me get better. But if my brain and my eye did not talk, he couldn't help me. And so I did all these tests to figure out, like, I could see a little bit of 3D, very little. And so he said, if you could see this much, I could help you see more. And so I did a lot of work with prisms. I did work with maps. Oh, do you know these hidden pictures? I hate that game. I could not find the things ever. And so I had bought these books. I forget the name of it used to be like in the doctor's office, you'd find the hidden pictures. Anyway, I bought a whole book of hidden pictures. It highlights. I bought a whole book of hidden pictures for kindergarten, first grade, and second graders. So I was working on the kindergarten book, and I had 2 friends that stayed over at my house. And they were like, oh my God, this is so fun. And they did the whole second grade book. I'm like, I'm not up to second grade. I'm only in kindergarten. And so I literally was like, I did whatever the doctor told me. I had all these charts, and I had to read things, and whatever he did. But it was, I would go for vision therapy for an hour, and then I had to go home and take a nap. It was so exhausting. And then I had to do whatever exercise there were. Whatever he gave me, I did for a week, and I came back. And when I left, I was like, oh man, it's too hard. And when I came back, I could do some of it. And then he would give me the next ones. And I'd be like, oh no, I'll keep the old ones. He's like, no, you're not keep the old ones. You have to do the next ones. And maybe that was part of like getting in the challenge way. But I was also going to a lot of therapy. And we were talking about all the different ways, like how do you see? And, when you don't have depth perception, like you guys said, there were things, I remember being in Dr. Brodney's office, and he was like, what things are hard for you? I'm like, I'm not very good at parallel parking, because that makes sense. I'm like, there's a reason I suck at parallel parking? He said, yes, because when you turn to the right and turn to the left, you can't stitch it together. I get lost. And that's part of the backpacking issue, and why I loved cruising, is I always knew where my room was. And I only had to figure out, like, oh, I'm going out for the day. I used to mostly go on the organized tour. I have to get on the bus. Okay, how do I get back from the bus? And when I would leave port, when I would walk away from the port, before I left, I would turn around and look back, because it looks different this direction than this direction. And if I didn't check, I would come back and I couldn't find my way back. And so it doesn't make you a very great traveler if all the time you're lost, just like it doesn't make you a good scuba diver if you don't take a breath before you get cleared away. But that was part of why I couldn't always get all the steps of the instructions. And these things just didn't always make sense. And it became obvious during all of these therapies. Like, I used to play Scrabble. They wouldn't let me play Scrabble on the ship for very long because, people were doing words like, oh, well, if I go here, it's 87 points and a triple. And if I go here, it's 53 points with the Q. And they're like, okay, Lisa, your turn. I'm like, C-A-T. I'm like, that is a terrible word. I'm like, that's all I got. There were just certain games I couldn't get. And most of the time growing up, I was very smart in certain ways and very incapable in other ways. And we just accepted it, like, she's clumsy. And in the 70s, before there was a lot of AYSO and soccer and all these things, it was kind of okay for girls to be nerdy, like I read books and I didn't do sports. I don't think now that people would tolerate that in the same way. I hope that someone would have been, and I've talked to people when I was doing a lot of different things and I was explaining what was wrong with my eyes, and several people had their daughters test, and I'm like, oh, they do have a problem with their eyes. So some of it's about, keeping up the standards. Like, why is this a problem? But fixing my eyes changed the way I interacted in a lot of ways.
Sure. One more question.
Did you have to eat any special brain food?
Is there brain food? Should I have?
Fish, I hear.
Oh.
Qu-
Lisa.
Yes.
So your book is very inspiring, and I can say I've read it.
Thank you.
And shared it with a lot of people. I'm curious to know, from all of this press tour and this talking about this, which you have been amazing at, what is the thing that somebody told you that touched you the most that inspired them about this book?
Oh. Well, I'm not well, I don't know if this counts, but I got a message on Instagram from a woman who said, you don't know me, but Instagram suggested I contact you, and I read your book and I dated Fred after you.
In that order?
And I heard a lot of the stories in your book, but they sounded different when I heard them from Fred. Shocker. And she said, it was really awful for me. The situation was quite terrible, and I felt so alone and embarrassed. And I read your book, and I feel so much better. So it was a very strange feeling, and that was surprising. But I have heard from different people, you know, like they read my book and they wanted to try something better. They always wanted to quit their job, or they always wanted to learn to swim, and that they felt inspired. But that was definitely the most shocking. I really never, I actually thought it was a little bit like on hidden camera, but.
Well, because I think that what your book does is it gives people permission to make changes in their life, or to leap out of a plane, or to try something new. So I would think you would be getting people saying that it gave them permission in a way for them to try something in their own life.
Thank you.
I have a small question since you're a professional shipwriter.
Yes.
I understand there's this whole new class of expedition Antarctic ships that are taking people down to the Antarctic that are newer and safer and better than the 80s,
Yes.
70s.
Yes.
Can you tell us anything more about what we should choose if we want to go to Antarctica, or about those boats?
Yes. So one of the reasons I went with Quark Expeditions is because I worked at sea for so many years. And I remember when the Grand Class came out for Princess Cruises, one of the things they talked about was the critical list of the ship. And I wanted to go into the ice with a team that's really all they do. And some of the things that we got to do on our ship, they had an open bridge policy, which is very rare since 9/11 that anybody's allowed. And in fact, it might not shock you to hear that I hula hooped on the bridge of the ship. And when I met the captain that night, because it was early on in the cruise, I looked at him and I said, I just want to say hello, I'm Lisa. I said, I'm the one that was hula hooping on the bridge. And he said, mm-hmm. He said, I spoke to the second officer and I said to him, did they at least ask? And I was like, Captain, I asked for permission. Alex said yes. He's like, I am aware. But it was shocking to me, having worked on ships so long, that they have an open bridge policy. But they're very open about how they're making choices, and they show everything. So for me, I think it's very important, a team. Like Quark only does Arctic and Antarctic. And so I wanted a trip where I was getting off the ship. Some of the major cruise lines, or the more mass market ships, cruise by Antarctica, but you never get off. So they can only have 100 people on land at a time. So a ship that's 200 people, you'll have 100 people on land and 100 people cruise in the Zodiacs, and then swap. So I would think 200 or less size ship, and a team that's what they do. Like for us, the 2 days sail from Ushuaia into Antarctica, we had lectures all day long by top people, PhDs in their field. We had marine talks, we had bird talks, we had a geologist. I felt like I was in school, and I was so happy. And it seemed like everybody was just as interested in learning. And I think that's part of why it was so, so much camaraderie, and we went to so many birthday parties. But I would definitely look for a ship that's built for expedition, and I'm happy for you to contact me if you're on your way to Antarctica. There's a few companies that they focus on that, and there's ways to look up the safety ratings, but I do think it's important that it's a purpose-built ship.
Great.
For the audience, we have in the crowd someone who's sailed in Antarctica with Captain Paul Watson of Sea Shepherd. Seriously, ask questions of him later.
Oh, excellent.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up our stream for the night. But for those of you in the audience, we do have our raffle afterwards, so please stick around for that. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your stories. It's been so much fun to talk to you and hear about your 50 things. Thank you, everyone who's here, for joining us tonight, and thank you, everyone on the stream, for joining us. Please do come by sometime and join us at our clubhouse. We do this every single Thursday. But that's going to do it for us tonight. Thank you, and have a good night.